The chamber was already full when Duravas arrived. That was the first sign. Sessions of the Galactic Council didn't start early, they didn't start on time either. Usually, they started late. 'Cause 47 species across 100 star systems had to synchronize their clocks, their translators, their diplomatic protocols, and their collective dislike of each other long enough to sit in the same room. Session started late always. This one had started early. She stood at the entrance arch and looked through the curved transparency wall into the chamber. Below, every seat filled, every delegation present, the great circular floor with its rings of tiered seating. Each tier color-coded by species, each color a different shade of something she had spent 11 years learning to read. The Delvarian, their deep blue; the Kethran, pale gold; the Morrigan collective in gray, always gray, all 12 of their seated representatives wearing the same expression, which was no expression at all. And at the center of the floor, the council speaker, a tall Delvari named Vas Aaron, no relation, standing at the podium with a data slate in his four-fingered hand, reading aloud. The session had started without her. Dara walked through the arch. Her footsteps on the stone floor made a sound that carried, and a few delegations in the lower tiers turned to look. She didn't slow down. She walked to the Earth observation box. Not a full seat, never a full seat. Earth was always an observer with full voting rights, which was a contradiction no one in the council had ever satisfactorily explained. And she sat down and she opened her earpiece and she listened. The speaker was reading in Galactic standard. She didn't need the earpiece for that. She had spoken Galactic standard since she was 19 years old, had dreamed in it by 24, had thought in it so often that sometimes her own memories played back in a language that wasn't hers. She heard every word without assistance. She heard the words, she understood them. She sat very still. Decree was formal, which meant it was long. It cited 72 subclauses of the Galactic Compact. It referenced 3 separate risk assessment bodies, 2 independent xenopsychology panels, and 1 historical precedent from 800 years ago involving a species called the Vreth, who no longer existed, which the decree was careful not to mention directly, but which everyone in the chamber knew. The language was precise and bureaucratic and completely bloodless. It said that Earth and all human settlements within council map space were to be relocated beyond the fringe belt, the outer boundary, the dead zone, the edge of everything the council had charted and then quietly decided not to chart further. Relocation to commence within 90 standard cycles. Full compliance expected. Non-compliance would result in, and here the language got very careful, very quiet, measures proportional to the risk assessment. The decree said this was not a punishment. The decree said this was a precautionary measure taken in the interest of galactic stability. The decree used the phrase unpredictable behavioral patterns 4 times. It used biological volatility twice. It used threat escalation potential once near the end. In a subordinate clause, the way you hide the thing you actually mean. Dara sat in the Earth observation box and listened to all of it. She did not move. She did not touch her earpiece. She breathed at a normal rate because she had learned a long time ago that the delegations around her watched her breathing, and she was not going to give them the satisfaction of watching it change. When the speaker finished rating, he set down the data slate and looked up. His eyes found the Earth box. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed something and was now deciding whether to say it. Whatever it was, he didn't say it. He cleared his throat instead. Dara stood up. The chamber got very quiet. Point of information, she said in Galactic Standard, loud enough that the sound carried to every tier. For the record, the vote. The speaker looked at her. Commander Voss, the session. The vote, she said again, not loudly, just clearly. I want the tally read into the record. How many voted yes? How many voted no? How many abstained? There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant someone was deciding whether refusing her request would look worse than granting it. The speaker made a small gesture to his aide. The aide pulled something up on a secondary slate. 46 in favor. The aide read 0 opposed, 1 abstention. Dara looked at the tiers. 46 species. She knew all of them. She had worked with all of them. She had sat in small rooms with their representatives for 11 years, learning their customs and their fears and their histories and the specific ways each of them held their bodies when they were lying. She had brokered the Keth Rao border settlement. She had carried the Morgan medical accord through 3 failed sessions by sheer refusal to leave the table. She had given the Delvarian intelligence on a human weapons test program that her own government had told her not to share because she believed transparency was worth more than leverage. All 46 of them had voted yes. She looked at the abstention, the Veth delegation, 4 of them in the highest tier and seats that were slightly too large for their insectoid frames. Ancient, older than any other species in the chamber by a factor that made the word old feel insufficient. The Veth had been present at the founding of the Galactic Council 8,000 years ago, and they had contributed almost nothing to it, since which the Council tolerated, because having the Veth present was considered a kind of legitimacy, a stamp from deep history that said this institution matters. The Veth abstained from everything, every vote, every resolution, every procedural motion. In 8,000 years of council membership, they had never cast a vote in either direction. They had abstained today, instead of voting yes, which meant for the Veth that this was the closest thing to a no they had ever produced. Dara looked at them for a moment. One of the 4 looked back, still as rock, dark, compound eyes that caught the chamber light and held it. Thank you, she said. To no one in particular. She walked to the exit. The chamber was absolutely silent. Her footsteps were the only sound, the same as when she came in, but different now in a way she could feel in her sternum. She got to the arch and stopped. She turned around. 47 species looked at her. We built fire on purpose, she said. Then she laughed. The shuttle back to the Earth diplomatic station took 40 minutes. She spent 39 of them sitting in the co-pilot seat with her eyes open and her hands flat on her knees, and her mind doing the thing it did when she was working, not thinking. Exactly, more like sorting, like a very fast and very cold librarian pulling files and placing them in order. 46 species, every one of them afraid of something specific. The Delvari were afraid of chaos. Humans were chaotic. They changed governments, changed directions, changed their minds in the middle of agreements. The Delvari had tried to work with that for 2 centuries and never stopped finding it alarming. The Kithra were afraid of expansion. Humans expanded. It was the thing they did most naturally and most relentlessly. The Kithra had watched human settlements spread across 43 star systems in 200 years and done the math on the next 200, and not like the answer the Morrigan Collective were afraid of. She had never been entirely sure what the Morrigan feared, but she knew they had voted yes, and she knew that the Morrigan never voted for anything they hadn't already decided was necessary, which meant they had decided this was necessary, which was the thing she kept returning to. She had thought they were different. She had thought that the medical accord meant something. She had thought she stopped thinking about it. The librarian put the file down and stepped back. Shuttle docked. She went inside her office in the Earth Diplomatic Station. Was a small room with a desk and a wall of screens and a window that looked out at a Delvari cityscape, towers of pale stone, very old, very beautiful, built by people who found human architecture incoherent. She had looked at that cityscape for 11 years and still found it lovely. She didn't know what to do with that. She sat at the desk and opened the council's public archive. She pulled up the fringe belt file. It was a standard exploratory record, survey, mission, sensor sweeps, the usual bureaucratic accumulation of data from expeditions that had gone out and come back with readings that said essentially nothing is there, which was itself a strange thing to report about a region of space that size. Nothing took up that much room. Nothing didn't usually generate the kind of faint interference readings she could see buried in the appendices if she went looking, and she was the kind of person who went looking. She went deeper past the public files into the archived surveys, some of them centuries old. Older the file, the more redacted, black lines through paragraphs, whole pages removed, the kind of redaction that didn't say, "We are protecting sensitive information." It said, "We decided a long time ago that you weren't going to see this." She worked through them patiently. 30 minutes. 40. The shuttle pilot knocked on the frame of the open door and told her that the Earth Council General wanted a briefing. She said she'd be 20 minutes. The pilot nodded and left. She kept reading. She pulled an expedition log from 600 years ago, the edges of the file corrupted with age, the redactions so heavy that whole sections were just black rectangles. But at the bottom of the document, in the metadata, the administrative tagging information that archivists added and that people almost never read, there was a single word that someone had flagged as classified 600 years ago and then apparently forgotten about because the classification marker had expired and no one had renewed it. One word, sleeper. She looked at it for a while. The word sat in the metadata like something that had been very carefully put somewhere and then very carefully not talked about for 6 centuries. She thought about the fringe belt, about the surveys that came back saying nothing is there, about the interference readings in the appendices, about the 46 species that had just voted to send 40,000 human beings to the one region of space that the council had charted and then quietly decided not to look at again. She thought about the Veth, the 900-million-year-old insectoids who had never voted on anything, who had abstained today. The pilot knocked. Again, she held up one finger without looking up. She copied the metadata file. She encrypted the copy. She sent it to her private research partition under a label that said personal diction notes, which was the kind of label no one ever opened. Then she closed the archive, straightened her jacket, and went to give the consul general his briefing. She told him everything about the vote, everything about the decree. She was precise and thorough and completely professional. She did not mention the word in the metadata. She was calibrating. That night she stood at the window of her quarters and looked at the Delve Erie towers and thought about fire, not metaphorically, actually. Literally the event, a hominid on a cold plain 300,000 years ago picking up a burning branch from a lightning strike and not dropping it. Every other animal in the history of Earth had learned to fear fire and run from it. One animal had picked it up and thought about what else it could do. The council called that volatility. She called it the whole story. 90 cycles, 12 colony ships, 40,000 people, the edge of the map. She pulled up the encrypted file on her personal screen and looked at the single word again. Sleeper. Something out there in the dark had been given a name. Something the council had known about for 600 years and buried so thoroughly that only a corrupted metadata tag remained. Something they had just exiled 40,000 humans toward. She didn't feel afraid. She had checked carefully, and fear wasn't the thing she felt. What she felt was close to what she imagined that hominid felt 300,000 years ago, standing in the cold with a burning branch in hand, the whole dark plain ahead, not safe, not reckless, ready. The convoy left at 3, not because 300 was a practical departure time. It wasn't half. The engineering crews were running on stimulants and cold coffee, and the particular kind of focus that comes from knowing that if you make a mistake right now, 40,000 people feel it. But Dara had chosen 300 deliberately, and the people who needed to understand why understood, and the people who didn't were too busy to ask. At 300, the council monitoring stations were at minimum staff. The overnight watch, the junior observers who filed reports that senior officials read 2 days later. Dara didn't want an audience for the crossing. She didn't want footage of 12 colony ships moving in formation toward the fringe belt broadcast across council news channels for 47 species to watch over their morning meals. She didn't want the pictures to exist. She wanted to leave the way you leave a room when you've decided you're never coming back, without making it a performance. The 12 ships were not beautiful. That was the first thing anyone said when they saw the convoy assembled for the first time, and it was true. Colony ships weren't built to be beautiful. They were built to carry things, people, equipment, seeds, livestock, medical stores, construction materials, water reclamation systems, soil processors, prefabricated housing units, 5 years of food supply minimum, and every piece of scientific and engineering equipment that Earth's government had been able to legally claim before the council asset freeze kicked. And at day 60 of the 90 cycle clock, they were wide and heavy, and they moved the way a fully loaded freight truck moves with the steady, indifferent momentum of something that has too much mass to be graceful and too much purpose to care about it. Dara's ship was the Persistence. She had not named it. It had been assigned to her. She had chosen to find the name appropriate. She was on the bridge when the convoy crossed the outer marker, the navigational boundary that the council had designated as the beginning of the fringe belt exclusion zone. The marker was just a signal buoy, a blinking light, and a transmission that said in 6 languages, beyond this point, restricted survey zone, proceed. Only with council authorization. They no longer needed council authorization. For anything, the buoy blinked at them. As they passed, Dora watched it on the rear camera until it was gone. Ren Cake was in the engine room when the Reliant died. He felt it before he heard it. Change in the convoy's communication. Frequency, a specific quality of silence. That his 11 years of engineering told him was not a system's pause but a system stop. He was already moving toward his console when the alert came through. Reliant, 7th ship in the convoy formation, had experienced a complete power failure, not a cascade, not a gradual drop, a full stop, the way a heart stops, everything running and then nothing running, and in between those two states, nothing but the instant of transition. He pulled up the diagnostic feed. Reliant systems were dark, all of them. Life support on emergency battery, which gave them 6 hours at full crew capacity. FTL. Offline, sublight offline navigation. Offline, the ship was sitting in the middle of the fringe belt like a stone, dropped in water going nowhere. He opened a channel to the bridge. Commander, Reliant is dead in space, complete power. Failure cause unknown. 6 hours on. Emergency battery, a pause short, the kind of pause that meant someone was doing the same math he had just done and arriving at the same answer, which was that there was no good answer, only a least bad one. Options, Dara said. We can't tow it, he said, not with standard equipment. Our tow cables aren't rated for a ship that size at full mass. He was already pulling up secondary schematics, but if we use the convoy's docking tethers, the emergency physical lines, not the maglock systems, and we distribute the load across 4 ships on each side, we can create a physical drag line. It won't be fast. It'll be about 3 km/h. But it'll move it. How long to clear the belt at that speed? He checked the nav data. They were at the belt's midpoint. 31 hours. Another pause. Do it. The tether operation took 4 hours to set up. 8 ships repositioned. 16 physical docking lines deployed, connected, tested, retested. The crew of Reliant, 412 people, was redistributed across the other 11 ships to reduce the battery load and extend their safe window. Children first. The Reliant is engineering crew stayed aboard to monitor the battery systems and watch for any sign of what had caused the failure. They found nothing. The power cells were intact. The reactor was intact. Every system that should have been running was in perfect working order. It was as if something had simply told the ship to stop, and the ship had stopped. Ren logged this and did not share his thoughts about it with anyone except his own private notation file, where he wrote, "Belt interference, signal interaction. Unknown, note for later." The convoy moved at 3 km/h through the dark. Dara did not sleep for the 31 hours of the tether crossing. She did not make an announcement about this or draw attention to it. She simply did not go to her bunk. She moved between the bridge and the engineering bay and the small communications room at the rear of the Persistence, where she had set up her personal research station, and she drank coffee that was bad even by colony ship standards, and she kept her face arranged in the expression she had spent a career perfecting, attentive, calm, slightly unimpressed. The face of Someone who has seen worse and expects to see worse again and is fine with that. At hour 11, a junior navigation officer named Sarah asked Dara if she was scared. Sarah was 23 years old. She had been assigned to the Exiled convoy 6 weeks before departure because she had requested the assignment, which meant she was either very brave or very young. And Dara suspected the answer was both. She asked the question directly with the particular honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned to bury direct questions under professional language. Dara looked at her for a moment. No. She said, "I'm calibrating." Sarah nodded slowly, the way people nod when they don't entirely understand an answer but can tell it's a real one. She turned back to her console. Dara went back to the communications room. At hour 19, Ren found the signal. He had been running passive sensor sweeps for the entire crossing, partly standard procedure, partly the same compulsive data gathering instinct that had made him a good engineer since he was 22 years old. The belt returned the same readings it always returned. Nothing. Flat sensor data, no radiation signatures, no gravitational anomalies, no electromagnetic activity of any kind. But at hour 19, at the precise geographic center of the fringe belt, the nothing changed. It was a single frequency, narrowband, very faint, the way a sound is faint when it is not close but very clear, the kind of faint that means source is confident, not struggling. It came from a direction forward and slightly below the convoy's plane of travel, deeper into the belt than any survey mission had mapped. He ran it through the standard identification database, no match. He ran it through the xenolinguistic archive, every known language, every known communication protocol in council records, no match. He ran it through the interference pattern library, the geological signal database, the pulsar catalog, nothing. He sat with it for a moment, then, not because he expected anything but because he was a person who tried things, he opened his personal mathematical notation software, the one he used for engineering calculations. Base 10 arithmetic, the counting system that humans had built from the accident of having 10 fingers, and he ran the signal against it. The signal was counting not randomly, not in a loop. It was counting upward in sequence in clean base 10 notation at a rate of 1 increment per 4.7 seconds. He watched it for 10 minutes. It did not deviate, it did not repeat, it just kept counting, patient and steady, like something that had been counting for a very long time and had no particular reason to stop. He stared at his screen for a while. He thought about the fact that no council species used base 10 mathematics. The Delvari used base 8, 8 fingers, 8 toes. The Kithra used base 12. The Morrigan used base 16, a system so abstracted from biology that Xena mathematicians still argued about how they had arrived at it. He had looked this up once years ago out of the professional curiosity of an engineer who liked to understand the foundations of things. Every species in the council had its own counting base and none of them were 10. He was the only base 10 species in council map space. He was the only one who would have recognized what he was looking at. He checked the signal's decay characteristics, the way its electromagnetic signature degraded over distance and time, which could be used to estimate the age of the source. The calculation took a few minutes. He ran it twice to be sure. The signal had Been broadcasting for approximately 4.3 million years. He sat very still for a moment, then he picked up his communicator and called Dara. She came to the engineering bay. He showed her the screen without preamble, the signal, the base 10 count, the decay estimate. She stood next to him and looked at it for a long time without speaking. How confident are you in the decay calculation? She said, within a 10% margin. Could be 3.9 million years. Could be 4.7. Not younger than 3.5, not older than 5. She was quiet again. Run it against every human mathematical system, she said, not just base 10. Everything, any notation we've ever used. He was already doing it. Base 10 was the match. Every other human system returned partial matches or no match. The signal was not generically mathematical, it was specifically, precisely base 10, before we had written language. Dara said, not a question, a statement made to the air in front of her. The first evidence of written human mathematical notation is about 5,000 years old. Ren said, this is 4.3 million years old. Whoever made this made it before we had symbols, before we had cities, before we had keep this between us, she said, for now. He nodded. She looked at the signal on the screen for another moment. The count ticked upward, patient, clear, utterly indifferent to the two humans watching it in a ship moving at 3 km/h through the dark. It knows we use base 10, she said. Quietly. Ren didn't answer. There wasn't much to add to that. At hour 31, Reliant cleared the fringe belt's far boundary. The tether lines released. Reliant power systems came back online 10 minutes later, all of them simultaneously, without any intervention from its engineering crew, as if whatever had turned them off had simply decided to turn them on again. Reliant, his chief engineer, filed a report that used the phrase unexplained spontaneous restoration 7 times because she could not think of a more accurate and was not willing to write what she actually suspected. The convoy reformed. 12 ships intact, full crew moving into deep fringe space under their own power. Dara stood on the bridge of the Persistence and watched the belt's edge recede on the rear display, a dark line against the stars already growing faint. She thought about the sleeper file. She thought about the signal. She thought about 4.3 million years, which was a number so large that she couldn't hold it as a feeling, only as a fact. Something had been out here counting in human numbers since before humans could count. Sarah was at the navigation console. She looked up from her screen and caught Dara's eye. We're clear, she said. All 12 ships, no casualties, no structural damage. Good, Dara said. Sarah hesitated. Commander, earlier when I asked if you were scared, what did you mean? Calibrating. Dara looked at the belt's edge on the screen. Already almost invisible, the dark zone that the Council had built and mapped, and then quietly decided not to look at. The place they had sent 40,000 humans to disappear into. It means, she said, that I'm deciding what kind of person to be on the other side of something. Sarah thought about that. And have you decided? Dara watched the belt fade to nothing on the display. Getting there, she said. The planet had no name yet. The colonists had been calling it gray, because that was what it was. Gray rock, gray sky, gray horizon in every direction. A world that looked like it had been painted by someone who ran out of other colors halfway through and Decided that was fine. The red dwarf sun hung low and dull, giving light without warmth the way a lamp gives light in a room that is still cold. The atmosphere was thin enough to breathe in short stretches with a rebreather assist, not enough oxygen to go without, enough to know that with time and work and the right equipment, it could become enough. Humans had looked at worse things and called them home. The habitation modules were up on the second planet, the marginally warm one, the one with liquid water under the ice at the poles, the one the geological teams had spent the first 6 weeks measuring and arguing about and eventually agreeing was survivable, which was the standard they were working to now, not comfortable, not ideal, survivable with effort, which was a standard humanity had met before. Dara had left the second planet that morning on a 4-person shuttle with Ren, a xenolinguist named Priya, and 2 geologists named Cass and Omar. She had told the colony administrator she was running a survey sweep of the third planet. She had not told him about the signal. She had not told him about the mathematical notation or the decay estimate or the word buried in a 600-year-old metadata file. She was still calibrating. The third planet was the dead one, temperature at the surface -190 C, atmosphere frozen nitrogen trace argon, nothing useful, no liquid water, no geological activity, no magnetic field to speak of. The survey drones had flagged it on day 1 as a long-term terraforming candidate, possible in 2 or 3 generations with the right equipment, and set it aside. Nothing to do there yet, nothing to find, except the signal was coming from there. Ren had narrowed the source coordinates over the 3 months since the crossing. The signal was steady, always from the same point, always the same base 10 count, ticking upward at 4.7-second intervals. He had triangulated it to within 100 m. The source was underground, the shuttle set down in a flat basin of gray rock. The surface was perfectly still, no wind, no movement, just a faint creak of the hull cooling in the extreme cold. They suited up in full thermal gear and stepped out and stood for a moment, looking at nothing. Cheerful, Priya said through the suit communicator. Survey teams have found worse, Omar said. Survey teams have found nothing. Cass said, that's literally what all the survey reports say, nothing here. Dara was already moving toward the signal source coordinates on her suit display. Follow me. They found the first cut marked 12 minutes into the walk. Cass almost missed it. She was looking at the ground composition, standard geological habit, always watching what you're walking on, and she stopped and crouched and looked at a section of rock face that jutted up from the basin floor at a low angle. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. This rock has been cut, she said. Everyone stopped. She ran her gloved hand along the edge. The cut was clean, not fractured, not eroded, not shaped by any geological process. She recognized it was a straight line in the rock, precise, deliberate, the kind of line that required a tool and an intention. How old? Dara asked. Cash shook her head. I'd need lab analysis for a precise date, but the weathering pattern. She looked at the surface more carefully. Millions of years. This is not recent. They followed the cut line. It led to another and another. The cuts formed a border, the edge of something that had been built here, or rather cut into the rock here, the way you cut a door frame before you put a door in it. The frame was large, more than large. Enough for a human being to walk through. The cuts are sized for us. Ren said quietly. Nobody answered that. The frame led down a ramp cut into the rock at a gentle angle, wide enough for 4 people to walk side by side. They descended. The temperature dropped further, which should not have been possible underground, away from the surface. Cold, but it did. Then 20 m. Down it stopped dropping, and then slowly it began to rise. At 40 m it was almost comfortable. Darren noticed this. Without commenting on it, she filed it in the part of her mind where she was keeping all the things she did not yet have words for. The structure at the bottom of the ramp was the size of a city block. That was the only scale that made sense. It filled the underground space, a space that had clearly been excavated deliberately, the ceiling cut as cleanly as the walls, the floor flat and smooth and covered in a material that was not rock and not any metal or composite she recognized. The material had a faint warmth to it, not heat source warmth, more like the warmth of something that had been in use recently. Except that made no sense at all. The structure itself was sealed, one large entrance circular, the door made of the same unrecognized material as the floor, set flush with the wall so that the seam was almost invisible. No hinges, no visible mechanism, no lock that she could identify, just the door, and on the door, etched into the surface in lines so precise they might have been made that morning, a sequence of numbers. Ren walked up to it. He looked at the sequence for about 30 seconds, then he made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. It's a question, he said. What's the question? Priya asked. It's a mathematical proof, incomplete. It states the first 8 steps and leaves the 9th blank. He tilted his head. It's not hard. It's the kind of problem a second-year engineering student could solve in their sleep. The answer is... He thought for half a second. Answer is 47. 47, Dara said. He nodded. She thought about 47 for a moment and what the number meant in another context, and then she put that away. Can you enter the answer? He looked at the door, ran his gloved hand over the surface near the number sequence. The material responded. Faint change in warmth under his hand. Slight brightening of the etched lines. It's touch sensitive, he said. He thought for a moment, then pressed his fingers to the surface in the sequence of 4 and 7. Nothing happened. He tried it differently, traced the numeral shapes directly on the surface. The lines brightened further. He finished tracing. Step back. The door opened. It didn't slide or swing. It dissolved. The material becoming briefly translucent and then simply absent. Pulled into the wall the way a breath is pulled into a chest. One moment a door. The next an open entrance. Warm air came out, not cold, not the frozen nothing of the planet's surface, warm, with a quality she couldn't name immediately, and then could. It was the quality of air in a room that has been ventilated and maintained, air that had been managed, kept at a specific condition. For how long she didn't want to calculate yet. They went in. Archives were everywhere. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, every surface covered in storage material, the same warm composite as the floor, and door shaped into units the size of large books, each unit faintly lit from within. There were thousands of them, tens of thousands. The room they entered first was the size of a warehouse, and it led to another and another, corridors branching off in a pattern that Ren, after a minute of looking, said reminded him of a library, which was exactly what it reminded Dara of too. Priya was already moving along the shelves, not touching, reading the surfaces. She had her scanner out. She was the xenolinguist. It was her job to look at unknown things and try to understand them, and she was doing it with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for this without knowing. She was waiting for it. The labeling system is mathematical, she said, not linguistic, numbers and symbols. Consistent notation, base 10, of course. It was. Cass called from deeper in the first room, come look at this. They went to her. She was standing in front of a section of the shelf units that were different from the others, larger. The internal light brighter, the material slightly different in texture. She had her scanner on one of them and was reading the output with an expression that people use when the data they are receiving is not the data they expected to receive. These are records of Earth, she said. Silence. Geological records, she said. I recognize the mineral signatures. These are core samples, stored data from core samples from Earth, pre-human Earth. Ocean composition, atmospheric records. She moved along the section slowly. Ice age data, volcanic records, biological markers. She stopped. There are records here of early hominids. Nobody spoke for a moment. They were watching us, Omar said. Whoever built this, they were watching Earth. They were documenting it, Priya said, and her voice had a specific quality, careful. The way a voice gets when the mind is working very fast and the mouth is trying to keep up. There's a difference. Watching is passive. This is archival. This is the work of someone who expected the records to be used. Later used by who? Omar said. Priya looked at Dara. Dara looked at the shelves. Keep going, Dara said. Priya found the recording chamber an hour later at the back of the deepest corridor. It was a smaller room than the others, circular, with a domed ceiling and a single raised platform in the center. No shelves, no storage units. Just the platform, and above it, nothing visible until Priya stepped through the entrance and the room recognized that someone had entered, and the recording began. It played from the air, not a screen, not a projection surface. Image simply existed in the space above. The platform, full three-dimensional. Absolutely clear, as sharp as something happening in real time. The figure in the recording was not human. That was the first thing. Not human, and not any species in any database Dara had ever accessed. Not council, not historical, not anything. It was tall and thin with proportions that suggested a different gravity than any of the planets she had stood on, and it had too many joints in its upper limbs, and its face was arranged around sensory organs that she could not map to any evolutionary logic she understood. It was wearing something, clothing or equipment or something that served both functions. The material moved when it moved, responsive, alive seeming. It spoke. The language was completely unknown, not unknown as in unfamiliar, but unknown as in outside the space of sounds and structures that our brain organized as language. It was not that she couldn't understand. It was that it sounded the way mathematics looks when you haven't learned the notation yet. Clearly a system, clearly carrying meaning, but without the key, just pattern. She stood next to Priya and watched and listened and understood nothing. And then near the end there was a phrase, short 5 or 6 sounds grouped closely, distinct from the surrounding language in some quality of emphasis or rhythm. Priya went very still. She listened to it. Twice the recording looped automatically, and Priya held up her hand for silence while it played through the second time. "Say what you're thinking," Dara said. Priya turned to her. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just had 15 years of work confirmed in a single moment and doesn't quite know where to put it. Spent 15 years studying pre-council linguistic artifacts, she said. Records the Council's Historical Accuracy Bureau classified records that apparently suggested there had been species in this galaxy before the current council. Members, much older species now gone. The Bureau said the records were corrupted data, misinterpreted signals. She paused. That phrase, that specific grouping of sounds, it appears in 3 of those classified records. I found it when I was 26 years old, and I spent 9 years trying to get the Bureau to acknowledge it existed. What does it mean? Dara said. Priya looked at her steadily. It means roughly as close as the phonetic mapping gets for the ones who come after fire. The room was very quiet. Say that again, Dara said. For the ones who come after fire. Dara stood in the middle of a room built 4 million years ago by a species that no longer existed, and looked at the recording of a being she couldn't, speaking a language she couldn't understand. And she heard that phrase, and something in her chest did a thing that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite wonder, and was somewhere in the narrow country between the two. The recording had been made for them, not clear's throat for humans generally, not for any species with 10 fingers, but for the specific humans who would arrive here, having been pushed out of every place they had been permitted to exist. The ones who come after fire. She thought about Dara on the bridge of the Persistence, asking if she was scared. She thought about the colony on the second planet, the gray habitation modules in the gray landscape, 40,000 people building something out of nothing because there was no other option. She thought about 46 species in a chamber voting yes, then the structure powered up, not the recording, not the archive that lights everything. Every sealed room opened, every corridor lit up simultaneously, every storage unit brightened from faint to full. The warm composite floor pulsed once, a single wave of light moving outward from the center of the structure, the way heartbeat moves outward from a chest, and then settled into a steady, constant, even glow. The light was warm, specifically, precisely warm, the wavelength of Earth's sun, the particular yellow-white that human eyes had evolved over millions of years to read as safe as home as the color the sky goes when everything is fine. Whatever had built this place had known what light would make a human feel safe. Dara stood in the center of it, the light on her face, the warmth of the floor through her boots, even through the suit insulation, the recording still playing silently above the platform. Behind her, she thought about the vote. 46 species, unpredictable, volatile, threatening, the exact words they had used, the exact reasons they had given for sending 40,000 people to the edge of the map and the edge of the light, the exact traits that had apparently been selected for 4 million years before the Galactic Council existed by something old enough to watch Earth before it had human beings on it. She started to Laugh not bitterly, not the sharp laugh of someone who has won an argument, the real kind, the kind that starts in the chest and means something is genuinely funny, which this was in the way that the largest things sometimes are. Priya looked at her, Ren looked at her. She put one hand against the warm wall of the room that had been waiting for her for 4 million years, and she laughed. And the sound of it went up into the domed ceiling and came back down, and it was the first sound made by a human being in this place, and it was laughter that felt right, that felt exactly right. The structure had a name for itself. Priya found it on the third day in a small inscription above the main entrance, the inside of the entrance, which meant it was meant to be read on the way out, not on the way in. She spent 6 hours with her scanner and her notes from 15 years of suppressed research before she was confident enough in the translation to say it out loud. She called it the depot, not because the word was poetic, because it was accurate. A depot was a place where things were stored for people who would need them later. A depot was practical and deliberate and built by someone who understood that the future would arrive and would have requirements. Inscription above the door didn't use that word. The inscription used a sound cluster that Priya's translation mapped most closely to concept, meaning the prepared place or what was left ready. But depot was close enough, and it had the right weight, and it stuck. The colonists on the second planet still didn't know what had been found. Dara had told the administrator that the survey team needed more time. The administrator was a careful man named Holt, who trusted Dara because she had never given him a reason not to, and because the look on her face when she said more time was the look of someone who had found something that needed to be understood before it could be explained. He gave her the time. Dara, Ren, Priya, Cass, and Omar rotated shifts in the depot for 3 weeks. They slept in the shuttle and ate packaged food and communicated with the colony only when necessary, and they worked. Ren worked the technology archives. This was the natural assignment. He was the engineer. The technology sections of the depot were organized in the same mathematical notation as everything else. Base 10, clean, logical, the work of minds that thought the way he thought, in systems and sequences, and the relationships between numbers. He moved through the archives the way he moved through any engineering problem, methodically, from foundations up, not rushing to the impressive parts before he understood the principles behind them. The principles were staggering. He started with the energy systems because energy was always the foundation. The depot's own power source was a decay-based design, which he had assumed meant something similar to the radioactive decay systems used in council and human engineering. Slow, reliable, long-lived, but ultimately finite. He was wrong. The depot system didn't decay toward zero. It decayed toward a lower energy stable state and then cycled back up, using the decay process itself as a driver for regeneration. It was not a battery running down. It was closer to a heartbeat, a rhythm that sustained itself. The engineering behind it was simple enough that he understood it within a day. Simple the way the wheel is simple. Obvious once you see it, invisible until you do. He moved to the propulsion archives. He had to sit down. The design was not faster than light travel the way the council understood it, not punching through space-time with a dedicated FTL Drive, not the fuel-heavy brute force of a jump engine. The architect propulsion system worked with space-time rather than against it. The way a sail works with wind rather than rowing against it. The mathematics were elegant. He read them 3 times, and then a 4th time because he didn't trust himself to have understood correctly. He had the fuel requirements were roughly 1/10 of current human FTL technology. The speed ceiling was he checked the calculation twice, approximately 40 times faster than persistence. At maximum jump, he wrote in his notation file, "We have been rowing, this is sailing." The medical archives took him longer to find. They were in a separate wing, deeper in the structure, behind a door that had required a second mathematical proof, more complex than the entrance, a multi-step proof that had taken him and Priya working together most of an afternoon. Behind the door, rows and rows of storage units, these ones with a different quality of light, the glow from inside more blue than warm, medical blue, the color of operating theaters and clean rooms and places where precision matters above all else. He started reading. The medical systems were built around carbon-based biology, specifically, narrowly, precisely around the biology of a species with 10 fingers, bilateral symmetry, mammalian cellular structure, and a specific chromosomal architecture that matched human genetics so closely it could not be coincidence. Every treatment, every diagnostic system, every pharmaceutical archive was key to a body that was within the margin of genetic variation. Human, the architects had not built a general medical database, they had built a human medical database. Ren moved through it slowly. He was not a medical professional, he was an engineer, but the notation system was the same throughout the depot, mathematical and clean, and the diagnostic archives had enough structural similarity to engineering schematics that he could follow the logic. He read treatment protocols for diseases he recognized and diseases he didn't. He found genetic repair systems that the Council's best medical technology couldn't touch. He found diagnostic tools that worked at the cellular level, non-invasive reading biology the way a scanner reads a data file. He found the treatment for Heron syndrome. He recognized it immediately, not because the depot labeled it that way. It didn't. It used a descriptive biological classification that mapped to the same condition. When he cross-referenced the chromosomal markers, he recognized it because he had spent 3 years reading every paper, every experimental protocol, every council medical database entry about Heron's syndrome that he could access. He had read them all. He had read the council's assessment that said the available treatment was biologically incompatible with human physiology without a modification process that would take 8 to 12 years of research to develop. He had read it and filed a formal request for emergency research authorization, and the request had been declined, and his daughter had died on a Tuesday in March, which was a detail he had noticed and then deliberately not thought about since. The treatment in the depot archive was not biologically incompatible with human physiology. It was designed for human physiology. It was, in fact, simpler than the Council's version, fewer steps, less invasive, a clear and readable protocol that he, as a non-medical engineer, could follow the logic of without difficulty. The Council had said the treatment couldn't be modified for humans in under 8 years. The architects had built it for humans 4 million years ago and left it here. He sat in the medical wing of the depot, on the floor, his back against a shelf of blue glowing storage units, and he looked at the protocol on his scanner screen for a long time. Her name was Amara. She had been 7 years old. She had liked the color orange and a particular series of animated films about a small robot who wanted to be an explorer, and she had been in the specific way of children who are ill for a long time. Very good at being patient, she had not complained. He had found that harder to bear than if she had. The file on the screen was useless to him. She had been dead for 3 years. There was nothing here. For him, there was nothing in any archive, in any structure, anywhere. The galaxy that was useful to him now in the specific way he needed it to be. He saved the file. He tagged it in his system under a label that said priority, immediate distribution, and added every human medical facility in the colony to the distribution list. He saved the full archive section, all of it, every treatment protocol he had read, and dozens he hadn't gotten to yet. He sat on the floor for a while longer. The blue light of the storage units was steady and even and indifferent. The way light is when it doesn't know what it's illuminating. Then he got up and he went back to the propulsion archives because there was work to do. Priya worked the historical records and the language archives, which were both enormous and deeply connected. History stored through language. Language explained through history. The two things wound around each other the way they always are when a civilization is trying to tell you who it was. The architect's own history, as far as she could reconstruct it, was incomplete. In the places she most wanted it to be complete, they were old, not just older than the council species, older than the galaxy's current stellar generation, which meant they had originated somewhere else entirely and traveled here from outside the Milky Way, which was a concept she wrote in her notes and then drew a box around and labeled. Process later, they were not a biological species in the way she understood biological. They had been once, but what they had become by the time they built the depot was something in between physical existence and something she had no clean word for. Not uploaded, not digital, something older than those concepts. They had traveled through this region of space for 3 million years ago, and they had found Earth. They had watched it for she couldn't pin the duration. The records were unclear, long enough to understand what was there, long enough to run the calculations forward, long enough to decide that what was coming deserved to be prepared for, and then they had left. Not died, left. The records gave no destination. What they left behind was the depot and a chain of other stations. She found references to multiple locations, the same mathematical pattern of placement that Wren had noticed in the signal data spread across the deep fringe in a configuration that matched human expansion modeling so precisely it made her hands unsteady when she mapped it. They had predicted where humanity would go, not in vague terms, in specific coordinates. She found the section on the fringe belt. On the 4th day, she read it carefully twice, making sure her translation was right. Then she went to find Dara. Dara was in the central archive working through the diplomatic and political records, or what she interpreted as diplomatic and political records, the sections dealing with Interaction between species, the protocols of contact and communication. She looked up when Priya came in. Priya sat down across from her and put her scanner on the table between them, with the translation open on the screen. Dara read it, she read it again. Belt was not a natural phenomenon. The architects had constructed it, not the rocks, not the gravitational structure, but the silence, the specific electromagnetic null zone that made every sensor return nothing, that caused systems failures in ships that lingered too long at the midpoint, that the Council had surveyed and resurveyed for centuries and never been able to explain. The architects had built the silence deliberately as a filter, a waiting room, with a test on the door. The test was the mathematics base 10. The architects had calculated that only a species with 10-digit biological origin, fingers, the counting of fingers, the most fundamental human act of quantification, would naturally develop base 10. Mathematics, every other species would arrive at the belt, find the silence, find the signal, run it against their own mathematical systems, get no match, and leave. The belt would mean nothing. To them, a base 10 species would find the signal and recognize it the way Wren had recognized it, not as an alien transmission but as counting, as something familiar in a place where nothing should be familiar. The belt had been waiting for humanity for 4.3 million years. Every other species that had mapped it and filed reports that said nothing is there had been telling the literal truth. For them there was nothing there. The door didn't exist for species that couldn't read the question. The Council has been flying past this for 8,000 years, Dara said. Longer, Priya said. The Veth have been members since the founding 900 million years. They've known about the belt the whole time. Dara looked at her. The Veth know, Priya said. The records reference them, not by name, by biological classification, and when I cross-referenced it, I had to check 3 times, but the match is solid. The architects knew the Veth. They interacted briefly before the architects left. They told the Veth what the belt was for. She paused. They eyed them too. Wait, the room was quiet. 900 million years, Dara said slowly. The Veth have been waiting for us for 900 million years. They voted no on the Exile, Priya said, not because they disagreed with the Council, because they knew what the Exile would do. Dara sat with that for a moment. The Veth in their 2 large seats in the highest tier of the Council chamber, compound eyes catching the light, the only dissenting vote in 8,000 years of membership. One of the 4 had looked at her when she looked back. It hadn't been sympathy, it had been patience. Deep, specific patience of something that had been waiting a very long time for a sequence of events to complete itself. She stood up. How long until Wren can tell me the propulsion systems are operational? Priya blinked. You'd have to ask Wren, but operational on what scale? For the shuttle, for 40 ships, Dara said. Priya stared at her. The Council exiled 40,000 people, Dara said. She picked up her scanner and her notes. Her voice was even the way it was even when she was thinking fastest. I want to go back with 4 million. She walked out of the archive room into the corridor, her footsteps steady on the warm composite floor, the earth sunlight falling on her from above, the whole vast, prepared weight of 4 million years of patience at her back. Priya sat alone in the room for a moment, then she picked up her scanner and went back to work. 3 years and 8 months after the Exiled, the fleet left the Red Dwarf system at 300. Dara had chosen the time. Again, some habits were worth keeping. The 12 colony ships were gone, not lost, not abandoned, taken apart with care and purpose, their hulls and frames and internal components stripped and fed into construction yards that had been running 20 hours a day for 2 years. In their place stood 40 vessels that had no name in any council catalog, no classification in any military database, no parallel in any design archive that any species currently alive had access to. They were built from architect schematics, the propulsion designs, the energy systems, the material science, translated by Wren and his engineering teams into something that human hands could actually build, human minds could actually operate, human bodies could actually crew. They were not beautiful either. Wren had said early in the construction process that they didn't need to be beautiful. They needed to be right. They were right. They were the most right things humanity had ever built, and they moved through space the way the architect schematics promised they would move, not punching through, not forcing anything, just going the way water goes downhill, with the calm momentum of something working with the universe rather than against it. 40,000 people had arrived in the fringe belt on 12 heavy colony ships, crawling at standard FTL speed, or leaving in 40 ships that made standard FTL look like walking. They crossed the fringe belt in 4 hours, the same crossing that had taken 31 hours of tether dragging, an emergency battery management, and cold coffee, and Dara not sleeping 4 hours. The belt silence parted for them the way Wren had half expected it would, not dramatically, not with any visible effect, just a quality of ease, the sensors returning clean readings, the systems running without interference, the midpoint passing without incident. At the center of the belt, the signal was still there, still counting upward. Base 10, 1 increment every 4.7 seconds. Wren watched it on his screen from the bridge of the lead ship. As they passed over it, he had named the lead ship the Amara. He had filed the paperwork himself, and no one had questioned it. The signal ticked upward as they crossed above the source. He watched it for the few minutes it was in range, then it stopped. Not a failure, not a signal drop. The count reached a number. He checked it, noted it, recognized that it was not a round number or an obvious milestone by any mathematical logic. He could it identify, and stopped. Complete, finished, whatever it had been counting toward, it had reached it. Whatever it had been waiting to count, it had counted it. He stared at the flat line on his screen for a long moment. Then he wrote the final number in his notation file and labeled it done. He put the scanner down and went back to monitoring the fleet's crossing. They came out of the belt's far edge into council space at 300 standard, and the monitoring station saw them immediately. Of course they did. 40 ships moving at a speed that no council species could produce, appearing from the direction of the fringe belt, the dead zone, the exile zone, the place that 40,000 humans had been sent to disappear into 4 years ago. The monitoring stations lit up. Automated alerts fired across a dozen communication networks. By the time Dara opened the channel, the council's emergency session was already convening. She didn't wait for them to finish convening. She opened the channel to the Full council frequency, every species, every station, every diplomatic terminal that received council broadcasts in. She spoke, she didn't announce herself. She didn't use her title or her rank or the formal opening protocol that council communications required. She just spoke. In Galactic Standard, in the same clear voice she had used in the council chamber 4 years ago when she had read her own exiled decree back to the species that had written it. This is Commander Dara Voss, representing Earth in her settlements. We've come back, we'd like to talk. She closed the channel. Waited. The response came after 11 minutes. 11 minutes was a long time for a council emergency broadcast. It meant someone had been making decisions about what to say. The voice that came back was the council speaker's, the Delvari Vassarin, the same one who had read the exiled decree while she sat in the observation box. He sounded, she thought, like a man who had rehearsed several different openings and discarded all of them. Commander Voss, you are in violation of exile. Decree 77 Alpha, the terms of the decree you are required to stand down and prepare for. She closed the channel. The asteroid belt had been a problem for 60 years. It occupied a corridor between 3 inhabited systems, 2 Kethra, 1 Delvari, and it was slowly, incrementally, through the standard drift of orbital mechanics, moving in a direction that would eventually threaten all 3. Eventually was a flexible word. Some calculations said 200 years. Some said 400. The council had been arguing about the discrepancy for 6 decades and had produced in that time 4 independent assessments, 2 contested resolution frameworks, and no action. Wren had identified it from the depot's astronomical records 3 months ago. He had run the architect terraforming array calculations against it in his spare time, which was the kind of thing he did in his spare time. Math was clean. The operation was straightforward. The array on one of the 40 ships was more than sufficient. He activated it now on Dara's signal. The array worked on a principle she still found difficult to hold in her mind. It interacted with the mass distribution of the target field, applying graduated gravitational influence across the whole field simultaneously rather than targeting individual rocks. Not a weapon, not a repulsor, more like a hand placed gently but firmly on something that was drifting the wrong way, redirecting it over the course of hours rather than shattering it over the course of seconds. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes. The asteroid belt, 60 years of unresolved council argument, 2 contested inhabited systems, 4 independent assessments, shifted, settled, and locked into a stable orbit that would not threaten anything for the next 12,000 years. Dara reopened the channel. She said nothing. She let the silence carry the demonstration the way the demonstration needed to be carried, not as a threat, not as a boast, just as a fact placed in the room. She waited. The first response didn't come from the council chamber. It came from the Veth. Their signal was direct, point-to-point, addressed to the Amara specifically, which meant they had identified the lead ship, which meant they had been watching the fleet since it crossed the belt, possibly since it left the red dwarf system. The message was short. Priya translated it from her station at the back of the bridge, her voice careful, and even in the way it got when the weight of something was pressing on it. We have been waiting for this. Transmission, she read for a very long time. Daryl looked at her, Priya looked back, neither of them spoke. Veth had known, she had understood this intellectually since Priya had found the depot's historical records 3 years ago. The architects had spoken to the Veth before leaving, had told them what the belt was for, had asked them to wait. 900 million years of waiting and seats, slightly too large for their insecto frames, abstaining from everything, casting the one dissenting vote at exactly the right moment, not because they disagreed with the exile, because they needed it to happen, because the sequence required it. The exile was the door. The Veth had known which key would open it. She pulled up the Veth's communication frequency and sent back 3 words in Galactic Standard. She thought about what to say for almost no time at all. The right words were obvious. "We found it." The response came back in seconds, which was the fastest the Veth had ever responded to anything in recorded council history. 1 word. "Good." The council full session responded 40 minutes after the asteroid belt operation completed. Every species on screen, the chamber visible in the background, all the tiers, all the colors, the great circular floor with the podium at the center. She could see in the frame the Earth observation box. It had not been removed. The chair she had sat in for 11 years was still there. She looked at it for a moment. The speaker spoke carefully. He was a careful man. She had always respected that about him, even now. Clears throat. "Earth is requesting readmission to the Galactic Council." She looked at the screen. She thought about the junior officer asking if she was scared. She thought about Ren on the floor of the medical wing with a file that was useless to him. She thought about Priya, 26 years old, finding a phrase in a classified record and spending 9 years being told it didn't exist. She thought about 46 species in a room voting yes, no, she said. Chamber erupted. Every feed spiked with sound. 47 translation channels, 47 simultaneous reactions, none of them quiet. She watched it. She let it run. Then she raised her hand, a human gesture that most council species had learned meant stop, and the chamber quieted, because 47 species had spent 200 years learning that when a human raised their hand, it was worth stopping, for we don't want our seat back, she said. We want 47 new seats. Silence, the complete kind, 1 for every species that voted yes, she said. Not punishment, not replacement, new seats. The council grows. She paused. We have things to teach you. Medical systems that will end diseases you have been treating for centuries. Energy technology that will make your fuel wars obsolete. Propulsion designs that will open regions of space you have never reached. Another pause. The shorter kind. We are going to teach these things whether you vote yes or no. The depot's archives are humanity's, and we will share them because that is what they were left to us to do, but it would go better for everyone if you vote yes. It tends to. She let that sit. You called us unpredictable, she said. Volatile, a threat, escalation risk. She looked at the screen at 46 species. Looking back at her, you were right. About all of it. We are all of those things. So was fire the first time someone picked it up. She let the last word land. We built it on purpose then. We're building something on purpose now. You can be part of it or you can watch. Those are the options. She waited. Vote took 3 hours. She did not watch it. She was in the Amara, small observation bay at the rear of the ship, a narrow room with a curved, transparent wall looking at it open. Space added to the design at her personal request because she had learned over 11 years of diplomatic work that she needed a room with no screens and no communicators and nothing requiring a response. Ren found her there an hour into the vote count. He stood next to her and looked at the stars without speaking, which was one of the things she valued about him. He understood when silence was the thing. They stood there for a while. The stars were different here than they had been from the Delvery cityscape she had looked at for 11 years, a different region of sky, different configurations. She had learned some of the fringe belt constellations over the past 4 years, without meaning to, the way you learn the view from a window. You look at every day. She knew the sky now. She hadn't expected to. The signal stopped. Ren said, when we crossed the belt. I know, Sarah told me. It counted for 4.3 million years and stopped when we came back through. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Whatever it was counting, it was counting us, wasn't it? The time, the distance from when they built it to when we finally did what they built it for. She thought about that, the patience of the number 4 million years of a single sequence ticking upward, waiting for the thing it was measuring to complete itself. I think so, she said. He nodded, looked out at the stars. What do you think happened to them? He said. The architects, where they went. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the depot and on the shuttle back to the second planet, and in the construction yards, and in the long quiet hours of the 3-year build. She didn't have an answer that was anything more than a feeling somewhere further. She said he accepted that. It was the kind of answer that was complete without being precise. The communicator on the wall chimed. She looked at it. The vote count was complete. Every species had voted yes. The final tally, she had asked for the full breakdown this time, not just the summary, showed yes votes, ranging from immediate to reluctant to barely but yes. Everyone, even the Morrigan Collective, whose yes vote she had not expected and did not entirely trust in, would spend a long time watching. Even the 3 Keth factions that had always been the most vocal about human expansion. Yes, the Veth had not voted. They never voted, but their representative in the chamber had done something that the council clerk had logged as unprecedented. They had placed one long-fingered hand flat on the voting console without activating it, a gesture that no one in the chamber recognized, that the diplomatic translation systems had no record of, that Priya would spend the next year researching and eventually conclude was an architect gesture learned 900 million years ago in a brief meeting between 2 civilizations held in the body of a Veth elder, like a word in a language no one else spoke, kept whole and waiting for the moment when it meant something. It meant something now. Dara stayed in the observation bay after Ren left. She looked at the stars for a long time. Behind her, the AMR was full of noise, crew responding to the vote result, communication channels opening across the fleet, the low, organized sound of 40,000 people beginning to understand what had just happened and what it meant. The sound was good. It was the sound of things starting. She looked back toward the fringe belt, a faint dark line at the edge of sensor range, already almost invisible at this distance. The place that 47 species had sent them to. Disappear, the place that had been waiting for them for 4 million years, with its doors open and its lights set to the color of home. She thought about the architects, the ones who had stood here or somewhere like here, in whatever form they had existed in at that point in their unimaginable history, and looked at Earth and run the calculation forward, and decided that what was coming was worth preparing for, worth the stations, worth the belt, worth asking the Veth to wait. They had seen humanity before. Humanity had words. They had seen the fire. She put her hand on the transparent wall. The material was faintly warm the way all architect-derived materials were warm, the residual property of systems designed to be hospitable to a specific kind of biology built into the substance of the thing at a level below engineering. Almost like instinct, they had built this for the ones who come after fire. She was standing in it. Ren's voice came over the communicator, gentle, there, asking for you on the main bridge. Council speaker wants to begin the formal seat negotiations. She looked at the belt one more time, the dark line, the waiting place, the door that had been open for 4 million years, and that she had walked through, and that was now behind her. Tell him we'll start tomorrow, she said. Tonight the crew eats together. A pause she could hear Ren smiling through it, not a sound. Exactly, just a quality of silence. Yes, Commander. She stayed at the window a little longer. The stars ahead were thick and close and unnamed, the deep fringe that no one had charted, and that 40 ships moving at architect speeds could reach in hours, days, weeks, distances that had been impossible now. Simply waiting, the way distances wait, when the right technology exists to cross them. The Council had 47 new seats to fill and 47 species to reorganize, and centuries of assumptions to begin revising. Humanity had an archive 4 million years deep in the stars ahead. She took her hand off the wall. She went to have dinner with her crew.